And welcome back, listeners. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Invisible Threat podcast. We are joined here, as is normal, by my esteemed co-host, I love saying Dr. Matt Eby. Matt, how are you doing, my man?
I'm doing very, very well, and it's been a few episodes now when I've been out of the home office, so I'm really happy to be back in with having the technology around is just there's something comforting about here with the headphones and the microphone and whatever now that I figured out how to turn it on. So had a little bit of problem with that here.
Yeah, so you're back in Kansas City, obviously, right? So ironically, and you know how I love time stamping these podcasts, I'm actually on the road this week, which normally I'm in my home studio and doing our podcast, but I'm on the road with my son, Carter Samuel, who you know very well. He is an aspiring golfer. We're in New Mexico. We drove here from Phoenix yesterday. It's about a 6-hour drive, 7 if you count the fact that I lost an hour coming here. But um, we have the U.S. Open qualifier. We got a practice round today. That's why I'm very casual going out. I'm his caddy. So we are going out today for his practice round, and then we tee off at 8:40 tomorrow morning, the very first attempt at trying to qualify for the U.S. Open for him.
All of us are certainly rooting for him, and so best of luck, CS. Hopefully, hit him long and straight, and yeah, I'm sure your dad's gonna help you out here. But one of the things that we said a couple of episodes ago, Carter, is that looking for that tension, right? And being able to mentally manage that tension is really, really important. So the discomfort of the round is so critically important to seek, and then being able to manage that tension. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that during this podcast with our special guests. So we're anxious to get to that.
Yeah, and I'm super excited about the our guest that we're gonna have come on, and we're gonna be bringing her on here just momentarily. But I loved whenever you said that to me about like seeking the discomfort, like it's almost like I want to go find it because I know that's what's gonna help me become better at my craft.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's so critically important that throughout your career and throughout your life that you build your skills, you build your ability to seek and manage tension. That's how you get to higher levels in life. And that's what this entire thing is about. It's not closing the moment, it's not trying to escape, but you have to be able to manage that tension and not to become overwhelmed by it. And as you seek out higher levels of competition, just like Carter Samuel is trying to do today, and you know this for yourself, you went and tried to become a better golfer by seeking out higher levels of competition. That's the way that this works. And then as you manage that tension and not let yourself become overwhelmed by it. We talked about that during the Masters with Rosie, right? And as he got closer and closer to finishing that, he became overwhelmed by the tension, and he couldn't manage that very well. And that's been a problem. It was a problem with Rory McIlroy for many, many, many years. And then you could see after he had won last year's championship at the Masters, how much better he was at managing that tension and seeking it this year. So
Yeah, and then back to back.
exactly correct. Those are clear, clear life lessons.
Matt, over the last few episodes, we've talked about how judgment forms inside individuals, right? And kind of thinking about that theme of Carter Samuel, but institutions as well as individuals and regulatory systems. And today we wanted to step away from theory and talk to our guest, who I'm really, really excited about. And I want to kind of talk about our guest. Today's guest is Lindsey Day, a seasoned trust administration professional with more than 15 years of experience in the financial services industry, including over a decade focused specifically on trust administration and fiduciary services. Lindsey also holds the prestigious CTFA designation and has built a reputation for helping families and professionals navigate the complexities of trust, estate administration, and legacy planning with clarity and care. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and bring in Lindsey Day. Lindsey, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you? Thanks for having me.
You are our first guest on the Invisible Threat podcast. So it's an honor to be able to have you. And obviously, Dr. Matt has worked with you in the past and he knows you very well. He spoke very highly of you. And he goes, I think Lindsey would be the perfect first guest for us.
Well, I appreciate it, Matt. Thanks for thinking of me. Happy to be here and talk about stepping into, discomfort. This is a little out of my comfort zone, so
Just to let you know that Lindsay was the person that the trust officer, the fiduciary that I relied upon to formulate, to create the design of my dissertation for my doctorate. She was the person that helped me build the original components of the doctorate when I went to my dissertation committee and positioned that. So Lindsay and I went to lunch one day and I tapped into her years of expertise, and it was accepted on the first pitch to my dissertation committee. So I am forever appreciative to Lindsay for that time and that the work that she did with me. So that's why I thought nobody better to have on the first podcast as a guest.
That's awesome. So Lindsay, give us a little bit of, where are you at located in the country so that our listeners have an idea of where they're listening to you from.
yep. So I am in Kansas City. So born and raised, always been out here. So my whole career's been in the Kansas City area.
Perfect. So I'd love to hear, how did you learn to think like a fiduciary from your experience that you've gained in your 15 years in this space?
Yeah, I mean, speaking for myself and probably most people, I think is just experience. You learn a lot from the person in the office next to you or the desk next to you. And just, when I got into the trust space of the financial industry, I started as as an assistant. And so, you're working closely with the trust officers, and you kind of start to absorb their train of thought and their voice, as you're helping them prepare, the first steps of the discretionary memo. And when you're starting to read the documents and learn how to read the documents, it really is a collaborative, industry and a collaborative profession. And I feel like, you really learn a lot from absorbing little bits from, all the people that sit next to you, every day and just, in the trenches with everybody day in and day out with all the different situations, learning from situations that, they may have had in the past that you're encountering for the first time. So, that's one of my favorite parts of the job is just that closeness and that learning from each other and, always having someone there with that experience or to go through the experience with you if it's everybody's first, situation.
So just out of curiosity, what was it then that originally kind of gave you the idea that this might be a career that you want to go towards, that like the whole trust industry?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I kind of happened into it almost by accident. It just ended up, like I said, as an assistant. And then again, just day in and day out, it's just you have that element of some of the same things every day, but it's always different. Like, yeah, you may be doing multiple discretionary requests, but every request is different from the other. You're reading a document, but every document is slightly different. Every family is slightly different. So you still get your routine and your day to day and that element of what you can expect, but you still get that, I guess, excitement or that, keep your interest because, it's even though it's the same, it's never the same.
You mentioned a couple times now about reading the document. So as you're reading the document, these are human beings that are connected to the document, obviously, right? So how, your early understanding of like of taking that into consideration with fiduciary responsibility, how does that work from early on, maybe even to what it's like now?
Yeah, I mean, I think at first for me, you are more reading it, you know, like a document, but then as you're start getting more involved and you're working more with the families, like you start to see, you know, the people that it represents. So, if you're lucky enough to have had a relationship with the grantor, I feel like you do have a deeper connection to like what that intent was behind the document, like, depending on when the family relationship was developed. So I think that's always really interesting and really beneficial. I think just to the us as professionals when you have that had the luxury of that relationship early on, in the life cycle of the trust and of the account and of the family legacy is to have that connection with the grantor so you really truly understand the intent at a little bit deeper level than just what the words say. And then developing those relationships with beneficiaries, where um they're next to people during all different seasons of life and different changes in life. And so you really get to know people, and to me does can have a bearing on how you're looking at making these decisions.
So that's actually a perfect segue because I'm curious, as far as, your fiduciary responsibility and your judgment changes across, because you've worked for multiple different trust companies. So as you've moved between different trust institutions, how has that fiduciary responsibility and judgment changed throughout the years? And maybe it's different between each institution.
As you guys have had discussions, in some of the former episodes, it does kind of start with that, how are you regulated and kind of, what can you do? What are you allowed to do? Just like it goes back to the document. I think Matt, when we went to lunch, that was one of the comments I made. Like, you're looking at the document and it's like, can we do this? But then there's this other element of should we do this? And I think that should we do this is kind of where the different institutions and the different, you know, regulatory bodies, that you're reporting up to have kind of that a little bit more of a, bearing on how you look at that. Should we do this? Um, in addition to, just the beneficiary situations and, all of those factors that you're taking into consideration. But I think it kind of, you're looking at the document first, can we? And then, should we is kind of, to me, the second step of those decisions.
I've lectured and I've taught in the industry for, I don't know, a long time. And it's, the question, your question, Carter, about how do people get into the trust industry? Well, what my joke is, as I say this, I have not met the fiduciary, I've not met the trust officer yet that says, in second grade, when I did show and tell, I came in and said, hey, everybody, and when I grow up, I want to be a trust officer. There's nobody, everybody comes in and says, I want to be a police officer. Maybe they say they want to be a bank teller. Maybe. Most of them say, I want to be a teacher. Those are common things. No kid ever went in second grade and said, I want to be a trust officer. Everybody that I've met said exactly what Lindsey just said. They fell into this, right? They were walking by a bank one day, the sewer cover opened, and they got sucked into the trust department. And the interview said, hey, can you spell trust? And when they spelled trust, they said, you're exactly the person that we need. And then they wound up into the trust company, looking around, going like, I don't even know what they do here. But it winds up where very quickly they either are a trust person or a non-trust person. If they're a non-trust person, they wash out very, very quickly. If you're a trust person, it winds up just getting into your bones and you're there virtually forever. So for the people that I know, like Lindsey and our colleagues and the people that have been on the podcast or listening to this, etc., if you're a fiduciary, you know what that means, especially a big F. And Lindsey and I will joke about this and we'll differentiate between big F fiduciary and little f fiduciary. And if you're a big F fiduciary like a trust officer versus a little f fiduciary like an investment advisor, the distinction is very clear to you as a big F fiduciary. And as Lindsey was just talking about the growth pattern between understanding what the document says and then understanding what the family or the grantor's intent was, that is a growth pattern that a capital F fiduciary moves into with a lot of experience. And then they understand what the should we do this interprets to. And that's one of the main things that we've been talking about in our podcast episodes about understanding the distinctions between little f fiduciary or no fiduciary at all, but then little f fiduciary and big F fiduciary, and how these environments are very, very different between the institutions that sponsor these activities inside of a trust company. And when you're a big F fiduciary inside of an OCC regulated institution versus that you're in an RIA affiliated one with that little F fiduciary, the influence that they have on the trust officer is normally fairly significant. And that's, I think, what Lindsey was alluding to. One of the questions that I have, Linz, is that can you describe about, in these different institutions, maybe compare and contrast a little bit, a bit about fiduciary tension? When the document isn't clear and you're trying to make a decision, describe what fiduciary tension actually feels like, and maybe compare and contrast between, the bigger institution and then RIA, or, affiliated, or a smaller institution like independent trust company, whatever, from your experience. Is that fiduciary tension that you have when it's ambiguous?
The document's unclear. That's usually when you're, having a deeper discussion in the committee, because you have your recommendation or your initial thoughts on, what you think after analyzing the situation. But, when you're in those different size committees, it does make a difference. The tension is different, at a smaller institution, a bank chartered trust company that tends to be a little bit more, risk averse, or a little bit, more conservative on the way that they make decisions, just as an institution because of their risk appetite. You do tend to see where, even though this may be an out of the box solution, or this may be kind of like, yeah, I think this should be allowed, but it's kind of on the edge of, what the document says, and it's a little unclear, or maybe it's just a larger amount, percentage of the, account value, than we're used to distributing. Like, people get a little bit more nervous. I think you see, some more consideration to the remainder beneficiaries a little bit. They're a little bit more worried about, hey, who's going to come back and say, hey, why did you, what did you guys do here? Why did you do that? Like, why did you give my mom that money? You should have saved it for me. So I think there's that tension's a little bit more there. And so going, back and forth from kind of a little bit more of a conservative traditional type of trust company to individual, independent chartered trust company, then, but, back to kind of a bank trust company that, it was almost a little bit of a shock. You go in expecting to be like, no, your recommendation is no, I don't think we should make this distribution. And then, you're sitting there at committee and they're like, oh, well, why not? Yeah, sure. Let's, we can do this. Or, okay, if we don't do that, then let's loan them money from, the trust, or let's, here are some out of the box solutions. And, that was, for me, that tension a little bit, because, at first my instinct is like, well, that's if we're comfortable loaning, then why don't we just make the distribution? Like, you kind of have that culture shock of like, well, wait a second. But then as you sit in it for a little bit, I do think that it's good to have those different experiences, because then, speaking for myself, it I think makes you a little bit more, well-rounded, or, you kinda keep the, one way of thinking still in the back of your mind, but then you're also allows you to kinda exercise that, like, "Hey, what other solutions could we have here?" Like, and kind of incorporating more of that out of the box thinking, but, kind of finding that middle ground that as an individual you're comfortable with. But the tension can definitely be palatable when when you're sitting there and, you have conflicting, opinions on, what the right course of action is.
You're talking about, going and looking at a discretionary distribution, saying that, well, maybe we'll loan them the money, but going all the way to using margin to make the distribution, because there's going to be some of these listeners who's never even considered that ever.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, again, definitely where, like, the institution or who you're, who's auditing, your actions and your decisions, that has a big factor in there. There's a lot of places that you wouldn't even bring that up as a suggestion because it's like there's absolutely no way we would entertain trying to do that. Like that's way too risky. That is way not anything that we would even consider. So I think, you know, for me, that's definitely a good example of how the institution can help form, even what the options of the different decisions are. Not even the final decision, just what are the options on the table that we even have to discuss. It makes a big difference.
How about on the allocation or investment side, anything with direct investment in crypto in a state settlement, right? That you wind up where the investor, the grantor, the decedent winds up where they have some type of digital currency or something in their personal portfolio, right? And then they wind up, it comes through in a state settlement. That's Carter's world, by the way, Lindsay. You don't know him very well, but Carter is in the estate world.
When I learned the phraseology, or the term rufata, however many years ago I learned about that, everybody in today's day and age, especially post COVID, has a digital footprint, some sort of digital footprint. So there is some sort of digital asset that needs to be settled, whether that's as easy as a Facebook account, and all those things have to, the proper language within the grantor's intent, obviously, and then given the authority to the whoever's going to settle those estates. Those are things we take into consideration. And again, not to get too deep into that, or what we proactively put into place well in advance to actually try to help your job become easier for determining, what's the quote unquote right answer of this document that I'm reading of the grantor's intent.
Well, I appreciate that. Any clarity we can have is appreciated.
Carrying this one level higher, so not just the organization and their charter, but in considering the regulators, right? So what effect has that had on your career? Have you looked through and not just considered the institution, right, and the rules and policy and procedure? Have you considered how it will look to, decisioning, whatever, with the exams or audits or whatever? Have you thought about that, or has committee thought about that? And how have the different regulatory structures influenced decisions?
Yeah, I think it definitely influences, at least how you document the decision, and how much what your discretionary packet looks like and what you're, including in that, and maybe how detailed the committee, minutes are and how much you capture that discussion. Um, and just the different levels of, what can one individual approve versus, then it has to, escalate to, dual, approval or committee approval. And um, so I think, that's kind of, at least for me, where I see that, you know, coming into play is just like, hey, yeah, what's the best way to document this so we're meeting, our requirements and we're not getting, questions that, we don't want to get later on, when we're being audited. So.
How has that differed between bigger and smaller or type of institution? Have you felt that you had to do more when you were with a bigger institution versus a smaller institution, or less, or how did that play out?
Yeah, I feel like it's similar, but when you're making the more complex decisions or, you're making these decisions that, are kind of on the border, in more you're thinking outside of the box and coming up with a solution like, well, okay, well, we'll loan the money out. So I think that's where, in my experience, you're really documenting a lot more because it's um I guess for lack of a better word, like exception or, it's a little bit more of a risky decision. So I think that, that's to me is where I've seen where you're wanting to document it more. I think, more established institutions, obviously, the process is a little bit more, laid out and, has been, they've been doing it the same for 15, 20, 30, 100 years. So, that they're pretty clear on what they're expecting it to look like to be, in good order to, process through committee and, to be in the files and to count. So I think you have a little bit more direction on exactly what, is being looked for. Where some of the newer, smaller institutions, you're still kind of developing that. Like, what does good look like? Like, what do we want to have, um, presented whenever we're asked for documentation?
In that same vein, I kind of have a question here that I've got written down that I really want to know, and I'd love this is the perfect segue. So, were there situations where the same fact pattern may have been handled differently depending on the institution?
Yeah, in my experience, definitely. I mean, there's things that I've seen presented at, one institution that never would have probably been hardly entertained, and it's, even if you're presenting it the same way, I could have seen it being declined in one institution, and then the other institution, it's like, oh yeah, that's, great. Yeah, oh, absolutely. Sure. No problem. So yeah, I do think you can take that, that same fact pattern or that same way of gathering, the information for the request and like, hey, here are the facts that that I've gathered and that I'm presenting, and here's how I based my decision. And definitely I can, you sit yourself kind of in the other room and you're like, well, here I don't think this would be approved, or I could see there being issues, or maybe it's not that it gets declined, but it's just like, hey, we're gonna, sit with this for a while. Let's discuss it, or go ask some follow-up questions. We want more information before we're comfortable with this. So yeah, I think it definitely makes a difference.
Yeah, nothing as simple as just like looking at the HIMSS powers within the document or anything like that, right?
Nope. Which even those aren't really simple, because everyone has a slightly different idea of what they, would consider, even education, which seems like a straightforward one, but, some people are comfortable with, you know, seminars and, even like self-help type of, conferences or getaways. And some people aren't comfortable with that. They want more traditional type of definition for education. So, yeah, I think you definitely see that risk appetite different between the institutions. And even though the facts may, the situation and the facts may be the same or very similar, based on which room you present that in, there's different appetite for that.
Let's kind of talk a little bit about, how does, regulation kind of shape behavior, right? So, how aware were you as an individual fiduciary of regulatory expectations while making some of the decisions, again, sort of in that same vein?
Well, I think that depending on the size of your institution, some of that comes through in the policies and procedures. So if you're looking at the policy and it's like, hey, this is already noted, this dollar amount or this type of asset is already considered an exception, I think it kind of trickles down, that way at, to the trust officer level. And again, depending on what the structure is or the length or of the history of the institution that you're working at, they've sometimes you have a lot more guidance on that, and so, you don't even get past the policy. You're like, "Well, this is clearly defined. This is here's the exception that I need to take if I wanna get this approved or if even wanna entertain this." In other places, maybe that those policies aren't as well defined, so you are kind of looking more like on your own or outside of that or in addition to your company policies, the institution policies, to kind of see like, hey, what even should can I present, what should I present, and what angle should I take to present this to get the outcome that I think is appropriate, for the beneficiaries.
I've never sat inside of the any type of a trust officer, those committees and things like that. I've learned a lot from both Dr. Matt and Joanne on the things that they've done throughout their years and everything. But I'm just wondering, have you seen situations where you've got all these judgments you're trying to make, right? You've got the policies and the procedures, and you've got the same fact pattern, you got different institutions, all these things. 15 years of doing this, right? The safest answer, did it start to feel like that's the right quote unquote answer because it was the safest answer?
And I do think that, to your point, is kind of too where like the institution and the regulating body comes into play, because there's definitely rooms I've sat in where, yeah, it feels like the safe answer is the answer that everybody wants to hear, and that's the right answer, quote unquote. And then other rooms that's, not necessarily the case. Or, that may even almost, the other side of the coin almost seem like, well, why would we go with the safe answer? Like, why would the safe answer be the right answer? Like, and I think it does influence, as an institution, hey, what effects does this have on the institution? Again, if somewhere where they're doing loans, they have no problem with doing promissory notes out of, the account, that does change what, options are available to you. And so where that might not feel like a safe answer, to most people, it's still like an easily acceptable answer depending on, what room you're sitting in. And I do think, if you go back to institution size and, regulatory bodies and, speed and all of that, I think, depending on where you're at, in some of the smaller institutions or the more traditional trust companies where, we're not necessarily known for being the fastest people in the world, but that's because a lot of conversation goes into these decisions and it's very thought out. I think there's, in those types of places, you have a lot of discussion before you with, your neighbor, the person sitting next to you, your mentor that sits, that's, above you, or your peer sitting in the office next to you. You have a lot of those conversations of, "Hey, what's your experience with this?" Or "What is, what have you seen this type of situation?" Or "What do you think?" You're familiar. We've talked about this, a lot. You're familiar with the beneficiary too. You had this account before me. Like, what do you think about this? So I think in those institutions, the smaller or the more traditional type of institutions, you're doing a lot of that discussion before you even go to like a committee level of discussion, where in maybe a more independent firm, you're worried about going quicker or faster, so you kind of, instead of having those discussions, that's had for the first time in committee, so you're getting, instead of just one or two people kind of hammering it out at a slower pace, you're getting 10 different feedback from 10 different points of view, all at once, which does change, that the temperature of the room. It does change, just that atmosphere of the committee meeting. It's a completely different type of meeting than, this has already been discussed. Here's what we think. Do you agree or not? Versus like brainstorming during the committee.
So that leads me to, a potential, what we'll call stabilizing force. Do you look at defensibility as a stabilizing force as you're in committees? And of course, that might be different depending on institutions that you've worked with before. But I'm just curious if that part of the judgment aspect of it about, is this a defensible position for us to take if we make this right answer?
Yeah, I mean, at least for me personally, before, like, if I'm just going to even present, that's kind of one of the things that, that I have in the back of my mind is like, how can I defend how I got to this decision? Like, does this make sense? How did I get, what are the three or four, points or facts or things that factored into my decision, and how can I, defend those, or how can I present those in a way to get the answer that I want, the response that I want? Because ultimately, I think, especially as, fiduciaries, we're in there presenting what we think is really the best decision for the client or the beneficiary, like overall. Like, hey, given all the things, this is what we really think is the best decision. So, I in my for myself kind of try to have that in the back of my mind. Okay, how did I get here, and how can, when I'm questioned, how can I show that, this is the right direction that I think, at least given what I know, I think is the way that we should go. So I think, yeah, you're always looking at, one, how can you just defend this in general, which hopefully is enough defense to, come up if you were to be audited or regulated, or, you have a remainder beneficiary ask why. Like, "Hey, well, here's how we got to this point, and here's how we made that decision."
Yeah, and I'll assume obviously what that means for the future also. Like we're making the decision now, right? There's a judgment, there's the process you've gone through, right? And these different institutions, again, because you worked in many different institutions. So I'm assuming what this decision creates as a, call it a butterfly effect, right? Down the road, those are things that are also taken into consideration for you, I'm assuming.
It is. And I mean, again, speaking for myself, I kind of take the, I know a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, if we do, and I think you guys have even said it, like, if we do it this time, we always have to say yes. And, I don't necessarily take that point of view. Like, I do think, yeah, you're going to look at prior decisions. Um, but, facts and circumstances change. And so if they change, they change, and that could change the outcome of the decision. So even though, yes, you're looking at prior decisions and prior, the roadmap that you got to get to that decision, I don't think that it like handcuffs you into, hey, because we said yes this time, we're always going to have to say yes. I don't take quite that firm of a stance on it, but it definitely can impact future decisions, especially if you were to leave, and someone new comes over and takes over the account, a lot of times they will just like, well, what have they done in the past? Okay, we'll just keep doing the same thing without maybe doing an independent review. So it can definitely affect it for sure.
So Lindsay Day, nine, maybe 2, 3, 4 years into being a trust officer, young trust officer. Now, Lindsay Day, today, with the experience that you have, what do you think younger trust officers misunderstand about discretion?
I think a big pitfall that maybe young trust officers fall into is um almost being too rigid of the document, or, not thinking through enough about the personal situations that are going on. Like, it may be letting outside influences of their own personal experiences maybe seep in to influence their decision too much. Like, yeah, it may seem like maybe this person shouldn't get a new car, but is it reasonable for the size of the account? Is it reasonable for the lifestyle that they've been living? Is it like maybe they don't need it, but could it still be a reasonable request? And I think, a lot of times you're too quick to either be like, no, no, especially if you're starting your career in a more, traditional trust company that's a little more risk averse and, is really worried about preserving for remainder beneficiaries, which, we obviously have to keep in mind. But maybe being a little bit too quick to judge and not ask enough questions of, why they're asking, for their discretionary requests that they're asking for, and looking into, other factors that are going on to say like, is this actually appropriate, or, or not appropriate?
Obviously, experience helps out a lot, I would assume, then, as you're taking into consideration fiduciary judgment and the difficultiness of that. It's more difficult the younger you are, or sometimes is it more difficult the more experienced you are? I'm curious about that.
I think from a professional standpoint, the more experience and the more situations you've encountered, um, that can play in a very positive way because, obviously you've encountered or you've seen them play out. I think personally, the more just life experience, if you're someone that's tends to be jaded by things, I think, you hear a lot of people worried about the discretion or the beneficiaries, taking advantage of the trust, or they're asking for things that maybe they shouldn't be asking for. And so I think, in that regard, maybe life experience can sometimes make you a little more leery of, the honesty of the beneficiary's request, or the appropriateness of, what they're asking for. But I think professionally, the more discussions that you're in, the more that you're, rubbing elbows with your peers, and learning about situations that they've encountered. And just the longer that, hopefully you're able to cultivate those relationships for years and years and years, and hopefully you have those close relationships with the beneficiaries, then in that case, the time I think is definitely beneficial to the decision.
So I'm just curious, over your 15 years, do you feel like, again, just personally, do you feel like you've become more cautious or just more adaptive, or maybe a little bit of both over that time?
I think more adaptive. I wouldn't say necessarily more cautious. I think I'm about the same there. Personally, I kind of take the viewpoint that, these were set up for the beneficiary, it's for their benefit. So, I tend to give people the benefit of the doubt until, I'm shown otherwise. So you may have a request that doesn't seem to fit within the lines of the document, but what else can we do to help? Like if you do need help with something, I may not be able to buy you the Ferrari, but we can upgrade, your SUV. That's fine. Like maybe we can, find a middle ground here. And still be able to help you. You obviously still need to keep the remainder beneficiaries in mind. And, some documents are a lot more specific about that than others. But I do think that it's here for the beneficiary, and unless there's specific intent otherwise listed in the document, we should be trying to kind of help maintain or maybe, give a 1% improvement on, the type of life that the beneficiary can live. So I'm probably somewhat generous, I guess. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but I always look at it, like I said, like, it is here for their benefit. So what can we do that's reasonable to benefit them?
And again, this is the space that I'm really in, and I'm sitting here thinking, and I've had this conversation, I don't know how many times with advisors as they've adopted our platform about the grantor's intent. From your perspective, I mean, isn't that's really, you're almost trying to read the grantor, like you're trying to read their mind a lot of times when you're making these decisions, I would assume then. Because they're not around anymore, right? You're executing the document, and you're like, okay, what was the grantor's intent in the first place here based upon the information I have?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you definitely are. And I think, like I've seen some documents that have, family, mission statements written out and kind of, which is all very helpful because you get a little bit, you can kind of step into their mindset a little bit more and see kind of what they really were intending for their legacy to look like. And hey, is the beneficiary living in the spirit of that legacy, or are they not? Is it completely different? Which can affect like how right or wrong. It can play a small factor into how you're looking at their request, and depending on the type of request, if it's appropriate or not.
I'm interested, technically speaking, right? What's a competent fiduciary look like? And what separates him from an exceptional fiduciary, technically speaking?
I mean, technically speaking, I think you're obviously looking at, hey, are you following the document? That's, technically that's, step one. Like, hey, we absolutely have to follow this document, stay within the rules that are, on this page. So I think like if I'm interpreting how you're saying technical correctly, like I think that's kind of number one. I think what makes an exceptional fiduciary is someone who's open to, hearing all the facts and not just like, oh, this is a request and making a decision, but kind of like I alluded to earlier, asking like a little bit more questions of why they're asking for this request. Like their request may seem off base or outside of the document, but maybe they're really needing help with something and they had no idea what to even ask for, where to start because they don't even understand the document. So, I think, you know, also having that relationship is helpful because then the beneficiary does understand the document. Then they're not coming to you with these crazy requests. They understand, how can this help me? How can this be here for me? And what's not acceptable within the document. Like because you do have benefit, we see all a wide range of situations. Some people really need help and really need, these funds that their parents work so hard for, or their grandparents, or, whoever it may be, to really just help them. Or maybe they've, chosen a very service type of life where they're, maybe a teacher in a school district that, where they're not getting paid a lot, but, hey, that's where their heart's at, so maybe they need a little bit more help to live, the same level of lifestyle that, somebody else who's, making 5 times as much, you may not need as much reliance on the trust. But, that doesn't mean that that person that's able to provide a lot for themselves isn't, you know, able to make requests. Or like you can't just say like, well, you're fine on your own. You don't need this. I'm not letting you have any of it. So you really have to be, I think, open-minded in a lot of ways, and um kind of agile in the way that you think, and really trying not to compare different situations. Even though it may seem like a similar request, really the situations are completely different. And so to me that can completely change, the way that you look at making that decision.
We call this the Invisible Threat Podcast. And what I'm getting ready to ask you, it really kind of, it- you may have to think about this one for a second, possibly. But what invisible pressures do people outside the industry not see?
Again, speaking for myself personally, I think one of the biggest what you could consider an individual pressure is just that responsibility of making the right decision. Like, you're a fiduciary. Like this is you your decision can potentially have a big factor on other people's lives in a positive or incidentally maybe a negative way. And so I think for me, that's probably the biggest invisible thread is it's not just, yes or no answers. It's not just you can have money, you can't have money, and here's why. There's a lot more, at least, I think again, maybe what separates a really great, outstanding fiduciary from one that's just competent is how much of that responsibility you really like feel responsible for, like, and really take on as when you're making these decisions. I don't think that that's something that everybody necessarily understands or thinks about, and maybe people in other areas of the financial industry because, they don't have that same responsibility for the decision. You know, when you're just a brokerage account and the owner calls and wants money, you just send the money. You don't even have to, you're not even thinking about it. It doesn't matter what it's for. So, and not that those people don't care about their clients, but um, I think for me that's probably the biggest invisible or unseen or maybe not as talked about type of thing that you really internalize or that you're really kind of battling with too. Like again, maybe the document kind of allows it, but gosh, I don't really know if we should do this. Like, I don't know if this is actually going to work out for their benefit, in the long run.
So that capital F fiduciary, pretty big responsibility, fair to say.
Absolutely, very fair to say that.
Over the last several episodes, we've talked about individuals, institutions, and systems shaping fiduciary judgment. What Lindsey, thank you again, Lindsey, for joining us, helped us to see today is that these aren't abstract concepts. They're lived realities inside the trust industry every single day. Most organizations move quickly through these moments. We don't. Lindsey, I want to thank you for joining us today for our first guest on the Invisible Threat podcast. I really did appreciate, and I mean it. Like I could seriously. Well, we're going to talk offline eventually because I've got to pick your brain some more because this 1 hour was not enough for me to get with Lindsey Day. Lindsey all day is what it's going to be next time we talk. Hey, Dr. Matt, thank you so much for allowing us and being able to convince Lindsey to come on as our first guest today. And
It didn't take too much convincing. Lindsay was ready to go and you could tell about the quality of the work she does and how, like I said, when I was talking about people who fall into the industry, when you do this and you are 15 years and Lindsay will be here the rest of her life, and she demonstrates that what capital F fiduciary, big F fiduciary really means. It is a life, it's a calling, it's not a job. You come in, you do this all day long. You take this home with you. You share these stories with friends and family. They normally don't understand what you're talking about, but it winds up where you find other trust officers in conferences and other people from the fiduciary industry. They understand what you're talking about. And it's a matter of caring for these. You become really part of the beneficiaries or the grantor's family as you have these accounts for years and years and years and years. This is not transactional business. This is the epitome of a relationship business. You become part of the family and they rely on you almost their entire lives, if not for their entire lives. So, Lindsay, thank you so much. So impressive. Always have been, and we certainly really appreciate it, and I'm sure our listeners will as well. So, thanks so much.
yeah, so listeners, hey, make sure to like, share, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, whether that be Google, Apple, Spotify, whatever the case may be. And make sure to come back and see us next time on the Invisible Threat Podcast. For Lindsey Day and Dr. Matt Eby, I'm Carter Wilcoxson, CEO and founder of Epic Services Company. Wishing you all a wonderful day. Lindsey, seriously, thank you so much for joining us today on the episode.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So until next time, listeners, we will see you on the Invisible Threat Podcast. Thank you, everybody.